Today, we're going to be hearing from Benjamin Schewel, an American Baha'i, currently living in Europe. He is a fellow in the Center for Religion, Conflict, and the Public Domain at the University of Groningen. That's in the Netherlands. He himself lives in Belgium. He is flying around, I'm sure, or taking the train quite a lot. He's also an affiliate scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, where he'd gotten his undergraduate degree, if I remember right. He's also a research and policy officer at the Baha'i International Community's European Office, and an auxiliary board member, right, Ben? Or he was just on the National Assembly of Belgium. I can't remember which.
No, yeah, I'm currently serving as a auxiliary board member.
Auxiliary board member, yeah. He received his PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University at Leuven in Belgium, and has also held visiting positions at the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Utrecht, and Addis Ababa. His research concentrates on questions concerning religion and history. His book, 7 Ways of Looking at Religion, I just showed you the title, was published in 2017, and he's currently working on a fascinating book. He's just published a paper related to it titled Encountering the Axial Age, and perhaps we'll hear more about that today as well. So at this point, we will turn the controls over to Ben. We will get his screen sharing, and he will be able to begin his presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Rob. Well, I'll start with another plug, insofar as we're on the self-promotion sort of moment. Just published an edited volume with Wilfrid Laurier University Press. It's in the Baha'i Study series. It's actually the second volume in that series. The first was Gate of the Heart by Nader Saidi. And so this edited volume, I co-edited it with Jeffrey Cameron, who's a friend from Canada. He works at the Office of Public Affairs for the Baha'i Community of Canada and is doing a PhD at the University of Toronto. So the book is called Religion and Public Discourse in an Age of Transition, Reflections on Baha'i Practice and Thought. And there's a number of very interesting articles in this book, which really were drafted collectively by the authors to not just be a collection of articles, but really sort of a coherent sequence of thoughts. And I think anyone who's interested in the Baha'i faith, in questions about religion and public discourse, would certainly find something of use in this volume. So hope you can have a look. So what I'm going to talk about today is my book, 7 Ways of Looking at Religion, the Major Narratives, which came out, as Rob mentioned, in September of 2017. But I'm going to go a little bit beyond just what I presented in that book and talk about the ways in which the narratives that I articulate, or the different ways of looking at religion that I articulate in this book, relate to different facets of the Baha'i Writings and the vision of religion and religious history that's contained in the Baha'i Writings. So I'll start by briefly describing sort of the setup that I use to get the book started. So what I begin with in this book is a description of kind of the state of the art within the broader academic study of religion. So this isn't just religious studies as a field, but it also includes philosophers, anthropologists, historians, sociologists, political scientists. And one of the arguments I make is that the academic discourse on religion across these disciplines is characterized by a common problematic. And this problematic is what I call the post-secular problematic. So this relates, the idea of the post-secular relates to the notion of the secular or secularization theory. And so this really became a paradigm for studying religion in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And the basic idea of secularization theory is that the forces of modernity are somehow inversely related to religion. So that the more modern we become, the less religious we ought to be. So in that way, the modernization of the world is correlated with the marginalization and the decline of religion. So again, when this becomes sort of a paradigm within which to study religion, to talk about religion, it begins to influence public policy, it influences education, it really dominates the social imaginary about the changing place of religion in the modern world. But beginning in the 1980s, this framework started to be disrupted. And there are several reasons for that. One of which was what some call the resurgence of public religion. You saw in contexts around the world, and whether it's in Iran or in the Catholic overthrow of role in overthrowing communism, or in liberation theology, or in Hindu nationalism or evangelical conservatism, religion played a very prominent role in important episodes of political conflict or revolution. But there were other things as well. Demographic studies started to show the enduringly high levels of religious practice and belief in the United States, and in fact even in Europe, but definitely throughout the rest of the world. So again, this idea that religion was going away, it's a bit harder to maintain, at least in that sort of classical sense that was being advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then a third thing that happened was people began to kind of critique secularization theory. They dug back into its history, showed how closely intertwined it was with Eurocentric worldviews, with colonialism, with sort of, Christocentric worldviews, and so they began to problematize it from another angle as well. And all of this was really sort of starting in the 1980s, but has only gained steam and intensity since then. So the problematic then, this post-secular problematic as I describe it, is basically how do we think about the changing place of religion in the modern world, if not through the lens of secularization? If we don't have this easy story to tell, what other story should we be telling? So what I did in the book was I carried out a pretty extensive analysis of the academic discourse on religion across disciplines. And what I found were there were basically 7 narrative frameworks that were being put forward as alternatives to classical secularization theory. So these narratives, as I describe them, are the Subtraction Narrative, the Renewal Narrative, the Transsecular Narrative, the Postnaturalist Narrative, the Construct Narrative, the Perennial Narrative, and the Developmental Narrative. So it's a lot of words I've thrown at you. Some of them might be soaring above your head right now. That's fine. I'm going to explain to you what they all mean. But one of the other points that I'll make, which isn't a point that I make in the book, but I think it's interesting for this audience, the audience of the Wilmette Institute, is to show that when one looks at the vision of religion presented in the Baha'i Writings, aspects of each of these narratives are confirmed, for lack of a better term, or there are sort of similar insights or ideas presented in the Baha'i Writings. So obviously the Baha'i Writings, you can't label them under any one of these narratives. It's something much more, something more complex. Nevertheless, it's interesting to see that in these various strands of the academic discourse on religion, there are diverse insights that are starting to resonate in interesting ways with the Baha'i Writings. And that starts to give us a sense of really the exciting possibilities for those who are coming from Baha'i background to draw upon contemporary scholarship to expand and enrich their own understanding of religion and religious history, but also for some insights drawn from the Baha'i Writings and the experiences of the Baha'i community to be brought into these various academic discourses as well. So that really is the kind of broader aim of this presentation, to kind of frame and maybe make it a bit more easy to imagine that kind of two-way exchange. So the first narrative is what I call the Subtraction Narrative. And what I've done is I'll have a quotation by a different author that kind of embodies the logic of each of these narratives. So there's a French philosopher, Marcel Gauchet. He writes, "The so-called major religions or universal religions, far from being the quintessential embodiment of religion, are in fact just so many stages of its abatement and disintegration. When dealing with religion, what appears to be an advance is actually a retreat." So I think this captures some of the real complexity of this idea of a subtraction narrative. But if one boils it down to its inner core, the idea is that religion emanates from the conditions of ignorance, of powerlessness, of passivity that plagued early human existence. For example, we didn't know why the storm came and destroyed our crops, and we wanted to stop storms from coming and destroying our crops back in the Paleolithic period. And so we thought, well, there must be some kind of entity or person behind us who's angry with us. And so if we can appease this sort of entity that lives in the clouds and make them no longer be angry with us, maybe we can do certain ritual acts of devotion, show them how committed we are, offer certain sacrifices. Maybe they'll stop destroying our crops. So in that regard, religion emanates from a kind of ignorance. And there are other ways, more sophisticated, of presenting that argument. So then as soon as you become more knowledgeable about the world, or you have more power to control the world, or you have a sort of a more dynamic relationship to the world, the reasons to be religious in that way are just subtracted directly out of human affairs. So again, it's this idea of more knowledge, more power, more dynamism, less religion. So what Gauchet is arguing here is that when you actually look at the history of religion, what you start to see is a kind of process of abstraction that we go from very kind of embodied visions of the gods to then a kind of divine pantheon that's somehow kind of up above the world, to then one God that sort of, is wholly outside the world, to then not even really a God, but just an abstract kind of God of the philosophers, to the point then where God just disappears altogether. So what we tend to talk about is kind of an advancement in religion, the movement from, animism to polytheism to monotheism to more philosophical conceptions, actually says that's part of the decline of religion. So what makes this narrative different than classical secularization theory is basically classical secularization theory, they were all subtraction narratives. That was the logic they were all advancing. But the difference with these new narratives is they say, well, that's simply how things ought to go if humanity was developing in the right way. If scientific education was universally sort of spread, if rates of equality were really advancing, if there was true economic justice and the promotion of human rights, then we would all actually be becoming atheists. So the argument there is somehow like if everyone was like Denmark or Scandinavia, the whole world, then religion would truly be disappearing in the way that the secularization theorists hoped that it would. Well, that's not happening, and it's likely not going to happen. Modernity isn't just about the kind of progress of civilization. It's also about new forms of oppression and illusion and superstition and violence. So then we can expect religion will continue in modernity. It just ought to go away if we were truly developing in the right way. So these are these kind of new subtraction narratives that are being put forward today. So, okay, you might say, obviously the Baha'i Writings don't envision the general marginalization and decline of religion. The Baha'i faith is a religion. It doesn't envision religion disappearing in the future. But the writings do suggest that certain aspects of previous religious formations will be and have to be abandoned as civilization evolves. So here's a quotation from Shoghi Effendi where he says, if long-cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formulae have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. Why should these, in a world subject to immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? So again, here we see an aspect of the subtraction narrative, an insight from it that is really confirmed and resonates with the vision of religious history presented in the Baha'i Writings, that as humanity advances, certain aspects of its religious history and practices have to be left behind and have to be subtracted out of human affairs. And that sort of goes hand in hand with progress. So the second narrative that I encountered was what I call the renewal narrative. And here's a quote from an American philosopher, a Catholic philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. And speaking about kind of the kind of chaos of the modern world, he writes, what matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, St. Benedict. So what MacIntyre is talking about here is looking at the kind of moral chaos of the modern world, hyperpolarization, nihilism, materialism, consumerism, just the kind of the confusion that surrounds all things moral in modern Western societies. He basically says there's no way to solve that problem within the resources of a modern civilization that's built on the legacy of the Enlightenment. The only way to solve those problems is actually to go back to that broader, more nuanced, more integral, encompassing Catholic tradition, which reached its apotheosis in Benedict, the Benedictine monasteries and Thomistic thought, and somehow a new basis of a new world order to be established in these kind of fringe communities on the outskirts of modern civilization. And as they mature and expand and grow, some new world order could emerge again from them, but it wouldn't be from out of the resources of the modern West. So again, the argument here is that in order to solve the problems of the modern world, we need to creatively renew our engagement with some older religious truth or religious tradition. And you'll see various versions of this renewal narrative. This is a kind of medieval Catholic renewal narrative, but in fact, all forms of conservatism and fundamentalism in one way or another are advancing renewal narrative. I mean, you think of some of the more aggressive forms of fundamentalist Islam, they're talking about the renewal of the pattern of life that was realized just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So we're going back to, late 600s, early 700s, the Common Era, and we want to renew that. That's how we can solve the problems of the modern world. But again, there are others, like Martin Heidegger would say, well, we have to go back to the pre-Socratics and their kind of open polytheistic spirituality. Or others would say, no, we have to go back even further to kind of the indigenous tribal life in which we're truly in harmony and in touch with nature. And that's the kind of way we can solve the problems of the modern world. But regardless, all of them are these narratives of renewal. So again, there are renewalist insights in the Baha'i Writings. On the one hand, the Baha'i Writings confirm that a decline of religion has played a central role in causing many of the problems of the modern world. And this is one of the core arguments that you'll find in the Baha'i Writings. But at the same time, they reject the idea that the problems of modernity could be solved by renewing some past religious form. That the only way that we could do this is through the coming of a new manifestation of God, who, from the Baha'i perspective, is Baha'u'llah, and by systematically and gradually over many years learning to translate what he has written and revealed into a new individual and collective reality. So here's a passage from The Promise of World Peace that I think talks about the sort of chaos that comes from the decline of religion and also the need somehow to renew it. So there's an insight, an aspect of that renewalist perspective that we find in the Baha'i Writings. Religion and religious institutions have for many decades been viewed by increasing numbers of people as irrelevant to the major concerns of the modern world. In its place, they have turned either to the hedonistic pursuit of material satisfactions or to the following of man-made ideologies designed to rescue society from the evident evils under which it groans. The fruits these doctrines have produced after decades of an increasingly unrestrained exercise of power by those who owe their ascendancy in human affairs to them are the social and economic ills that blight every region of our world in the closing years of the 20th century. So the third narrative that I found as a proposed replacement for the classical narrative of secularization is what I call the transsecular narrative. Now, it's a somewhat ugly term, and I tried very hard to find something a bit more sharp and intuitive, but I couldn't. This is about as accurate as it gets, as far as I can tell. So the idea of a transsecular narrative is that the secularization theorists were partially right when they saw that we could no longer be religious in the way that we were in the pre-modern world, that something about the conditions of modernity made the kind of religion that we had during pre-modernity impossible. But that doesn't mean that religion is just declining. All it means is that religion is undergoing a fundamental transformation. So that's the say of a transsecular. It's a kind of secularization, but it's broader and larger. It goes beyond that classical narrative. So Jeffrey Stout, who's an American philosopher of religion, he writes, there's a sense in which the ethical discourse of most modern democracies is secularized. But secularization in this sense is not a reflection of commitment to secularism. It entails neither the denial of theological assumptions nor the expulsion of theological expression from the public sphere. It just means that the age of theocracy is over. So I think to translate a bit what he's saying is that modern Western democracies are secularized in the sense that the kind of, let's say, hegemonic or sort of ruling or socially and politically ruling forms of religion that we had during pre-modernity that characterized the Catholic Church before the treaties of Westphalia, or the Protestant churches in the German regions before that as well, and the kind of broadly this notion of, let's say, a theocratic rule, that kind of religion no longer is possible in modern democratic societies. So in that regard, we can say that there's been a kind of secularization. But that doesn't mean we have a commitment to secularism as a positive ideology. Secularism as sort of the belief that religion is going away, the belief that religion is false, any of these things. This isn't part of the ideology. So the transsecular insights in the Baha'i Writings, again, they affirm that humanity is proceeding through an age of transition. In which all aspects of its social and spiritual life are being transformed. But again, they're not going to say that the process of transformation is somehow just a movement toward American-style pluralism, which is the argument that you tend to find in most transsecular narratives, which is to say that, okay, there is a process of secularization taking place. We can't be religious in the kind of theocratic way that we hypothetically were during pre-modernity, and that's because we have these new conditions of plurality. So what we're moving from is a kind of hegemonic theocratic religion to a new form of religious pluralism, somehow the case study of which appears in North American society. So somehow everyone is going to become increasingly like sort of American pluralists. So the Baha'i Writings, they affirm this kind of process. Well, somehow religion is changing in its form, but it doesn't envision the end of that change, or at least the ideal form of that change, being American-style pluralism. So here's another quotation that I think shows the resonance of aspects of the transsecular narrative with the Baha'i Writings. The turmoil and crises of our time underlie a momentous transition in human affairs. Simultaneous processes of disintegration and integration have clearly been accelerating throughout the planet since the Bab appeared in Persia. That our Earth has contracted into a neighborhood no one can seriously deny. The world is being made new. So the postnaturalist narrative, in one way, you could place it underneath the transsecular narrative because it has a similar structure. But basically, I felt that it had become so significant on its own that it deserved to have its individual treatment. And the postnaturalist narrative is basically the kind of story that people tell when they're going to write about the relationship between science and religion, and they're going to try to argue that, well, somehow there doesn't need to be the kind of conflict between science and religion that we tend to assume in discourse today. So the basic idea is that modern science rightfully disrupted our pre-modern views of nature, that Newton and Galileo and Copernicus, it was a good thing that they systematically undermined and destroyed the teleological Aristotelian view of nature that had dominated science and thought for thousands of years. But the problem is that modern science became falsely identified with a naturalistic ideology or a naturalistic metaphysical system. So in that regard, this idea of a conflict between science and religion, it's actually a conflict between a religious metaphysics and a naturalistic metaphysics. And that has nothing to do with science as such. So the postnaturalist narrative will say that now that we've started to see that naturalism is not equivalent with modern science, which has come partially from a critique of naturalism, but also the continued advancement of modern science into things like quantum theory or relativity theory, chaos theory. They start to show us that there are new ways of thinking about kind of the place of spiritual or transcendent phenomena in a scientifically understood universe. So Alvin Plantinga is a very famous philosopher of religion. He says very clearly, elaborating the kind of logic of this post-naturalist narrative, there is no real conflict between theistic religion and the scientific theory of evolution. What there is instead is conflict between theistic religion and a philosophical gloss or add-on to the scientific doctrine of evolution. The claim that evolution is undirected, unguided, unorchestrated by God or anyone else. So again here, this narrative is to say it's not about science and religion, it's about naturalism, which is an addition to science and religious or theistic worldview. So again, there are aspects of the Baha'i Writings that will resonate deeply with this post-naturalist narrative. So the Baha'i Writings critique the dogmatic materialism that claims to be the voice of science and seeks to systematically exclude from intellectual life all impulses arising from the spiritual level of human consciousness. That's from Century of Love. The Baha'i teachings also confirm the legitimacy of the modern scientific enterprise and state that religious insights must be constantly examined in the light of scientific findings. So on this latter point, there's a quotation from Shoghi Finney that I think captures the feeling that a scientific mindset, broadly construed, is essential to a true understanding and true practice of religion from a Baha'i perspective. It is hoped that all the Baha'i students will follow the noble example you have set before them and will henceforth be led to investigate and analyze the principles of the faith and to correlate them with the modern aspects of philosophy and science. Every intelligent and thoughtful young Baha'i should always approach the cause in this way, for therein lies the very essence of the principle of independent investigation of truth. So the fifth narrative that I encountered in the broader academic discourse on religion, and this is one of the hot ones today. I don't know if it'll be hot in a decade, but today this is sort of the sexy one, particularly in the field of religious studies. And the idea is that the very concept of religion as a general universal phenomenon that's variously instantiated throughout history and around the world, this concept of a thing called religion was invented, was constructed in the modern period. And then it was projected outward onto, by Westerners, it projected outward onto non-Western peoples and backwards onto the rest of history. But the question is that if this concept was constructed, maybe there isn't such a thing as religion, a general religion, so that we can say, oh, there's Islamic religion, there's Hindu religion, there's Buddhist religion. Maybe that's all an illusion. And maybe instead we just have to learn to think about, well, there were gods and deities and spirits and rituals and prayers and temples that are just part of civilizations. And so instead of separating that and speaking of it as religion, we just have to look at different facets of civilization. So this one author, Brenton Bree, who wrote a book called Before Religion, there's a quotation. He says, all of this raises the question of how and when people came to conceptualize the world as divided between religious and secular in the modern sense, and to think of the religious realm as being divided into distinct religions, the so-called world religions. So it sort of looks at the intellectual history of the very idea of world religions or religion. And more often than not, those who do this are trying to deconstruct the idea to show how it's either an illusion or a masked political endeavor, or that somehow is kind of just illegitimate. Not everyone does this, but this is sort of the broader sort of project, and it's influenced by a certain intellectual lineage, which is deeply influenced by Foucault. But this is sort of, you find, every third week a new book on Confucianism as religion, the invention of Judaism as religion, the invention of religion, Egyptian religion and the invention of religion, or there's just a million permutations of it, and it's interesting. But there's a common narrative logic that you find again and again. It's this logic of the construct narrative, that the invention of the concept of religion itself has become a major force in human history. And so by deconstructing, analyzing that concept, we can maybe have a better and more kind of just or free outcome. So again, in the Baha'i writings, you find aspects of the construct narrative that are confirmed, that resonate with the Baha'i writings. The Baha'i teachings acknowledge the confusion that surrounds virtually every aspect of the subject of religion, and are particularly critical of the idea that by religion is intended the multitude of sects currently in existence. So in fact, the situation has become so dire that Baha'is believe that humanity must recast the whole conception of religion. But at the same time, the Baha'i writings aren't going to go in as a deconstructive approach, as you would find in the contemporary discourse, that the Baha'i teachings present the emergence of a general concept of religion as evidence of our growing consciousness of the oneness of humankind. So now it's important not to then make the jump to say, oh, well, the Western ideas about religion and what religion is as one universal thing. That's what the Baha'i writings mean when they talk about the oneness of religion. It's obviously not. But I think the point is that the task from a Baha'i perspective is not simply to kind of tear down humanity's problematic notions of religious, as many construct narratives do, but rather to work to remold and to improve them. So gradually we can have a more robust, a more profound vision of religion as or one thing. So the sixth narrative is what I call the perennial narrative. And this is the idea that throughout history and around the world, religion exhibits common characteristics. So that there's a common structure of experience, a common ideological configuration, a common sociological configuration, but wherever we look, wherever we're looking at religion, we're going to find the same things perennially. So here's a female, I guess the term would be, she's not a mystic, but she's a scholar of mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, very famous, one of the kind of the paradigm-making books in this field. But she said, the most highly developed branches of the human family tend to produce a curious and definite type of personality. We meet these persons in the East and the West, in the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds. Their one passion appears to be the prosecution of a certain spiritual and intangible quest, the finding of a way out or a way back to some desirable state in which alone they can satisfy their craving for absolute truth. So what Evelyn Underhill is going to argue here is that there's this one existential structure of the kind of the mystic and the prophet, and that if we really analyze and understand the kind of roots and common structures of mysticism, we can understand the roots and common structures of religion as a whole. But again, you'll find different versions of this perennial narrative. You'll find others who will say, well, in all the religions we see this encounter with mysterium tremendum, This is, Otto makes this argument. Or all religion is about this transformation of self-centeredness into other-centeredness. This is John Hick. So again, again and again, this logic of kind of a perennial structure emerges. You also find it, quite interestingly, an increasingly popular public discourse on the idea of being spiritual but not religious, that there's this kind of one higher realm of spiritual truth that the different traditions are just kind of ways of helping us access. But once we can kind of get there, we don't need those traditions anymore. Maybe we can just pick and choose from those traditions as it helps us in our own spiritual quest. So in this regard, the perennial narrative is increasingly popular within kind of the public sphere today. So obviously, for anyone familiar with the Baha'i Writings, there are aspects of perenniality that are described and presented. Baha'u'llah describes his own message as the most recent expression of the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. Abdu'l-Baha also states that the prophets and manifestations of God bring always the same teaching. So again, this is a perennial process that's being described. But the Baha'i Writings transcend the perennial narrative by locating religious diversity within a broader evolutionary perspective. So it's not just the perennial recurrence that's emphasized, there's also a dimension of development. And I think this leads us to the seventh and final narrative that I identified, which is the developmental narrative. So Hegel, a German philosopher, his writings are quite complex. I've spent many years reading them. I do not recommend that you do that as well. Very interesting thinker, unnecessarily complex. But he says the progression of historical religions is a condition for the arrival of religion at its absolute truth. These determinate religions are definite stages of the consciousness and knowledge of spirit. They are necessary conditions for the emergence of the true religion, for the authentic consciousness of spirit. So what Hegel's describing here is a developmental process in which different religions are somehow stages in the broader evolution of religion towards some kind of culmination. So you read in his philosophy of religion, begins with kind of these animistic religions and step by step talks about Chinese religion, Hindu religion, Buddhist religion, Zoroastrianism, Jewish religion, Greek religion, Roman religion, then you reach kind of Christianity, the apotheosis of religion. So each of these religions are like a stage in a process of development and evolution. But you also see kind of, you might say, less triumphalistic developmental narratives that are being advanced today. So for example, Robert Bellah is a very famous sociologist of religion. His last great work was called Religion and Human Evolution. And he argues that if you look back at religious history, you can see certain stages that correlate with the growing stages of religious history that correlate with the growing complexity of human civilization. So there's a certain kind of religion that correlates with what we might call the tribal, kind of Paleolithic, early Neolithic phase of collective existence. But then once we get to that kind of archaic civilization of, let's say, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, Incas, there's a new form of religion, archaic religion, which is centered on the divine king that we see somewhat universally. And then once we arrive at literate societies, we get axial religion, which are religions that are not rooted to a certain ruler or a certain location, but they're kind of universal. They can be spread through books, through arguments. They ask each individual to transform, perfect themselves. So a new form of religion takes shape there. And he says these forms of religion aren't necessarily better spiritually or morally than those that came before. They're simply more complex. So he tells a developmental narrative that isn't kind of a progressivist narrative, whereas Hegel's is completely progressivist to the point where we know the one final true religion. That's a certain form of Christianity. So again, one finds developmental insights in the Baha'i writings. The Baha'i teachings affirm the idea that the historical development of religion stimulated a gradual awakening of humankind to its capacities and responsibilities. The Baha'i teachings affirm the idea that the historical development of religion, I repeated that, but I guess the point I was going to add there was that they also said that religion has proceeded through certain kind of drastically different stages. I mean, there's this notion of cycles, the cycle of prophecy, the cycle of fulfillment, and this idea that somehow from Adam as a mythic sort of early prophet to Muhammad, you see a certain form of religion that emerges. After that, with the emergence of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, a whole new pattern of religious life is beginning to take shape. But what's interesting is even before this kind of so-called Adamic cycle, there's this idea in the Baha'i writings that there was a different stage of religious history. and I'll read you this quotation from Baha'i. It says, that no records concerning early prophets are now available should be attributed to their extreme remoteness, as well as to the vast changes which the earth has undergone since their time. Moreover, such forms and modes of writing as are now current amongst men were unknown to the generations that were before Adam. There was even a time when men were wholly ignorant of the art of writing and had adopted a system entirely different from the one which they now use. Witness, therefore, how numerous and far-reaching have been the changes in language, speech, and writing since the days of Adam. How much greater must have been the changes before him. So in this regard, some aspects of this kind of stage-like view of religious history, in which religion functions in one way, begins to function in another, and then at a certain point functions in another way still. These processes are building upon each other in a developmental way. This is also central to the vision of religious history presented in the Baha'i Writings. So, in the book, after I present these 7 narratives, which again are meant to be the frameworks within the broad academic discourse on religion that's trying to resolve this post-secular problematic, that's trying to tell a new story of religious history. How do we think about the fact that there are really well-read, thoughtful people who are arguing for each of these different narrative lenses? So you could say, well, okay, there's some kind of competition, and they're just, these different narratives are going to have to argue with and against each other until one emerges as supreme. Or you could say, well, no, these narratives we shouldn't think of them as kind of big narratives, or at least we shouldn't use them as big narratives, but we should just think of them as these kind of heuristic lenses through which we can analyze sort of micro facets of different religious sort of developments throughout history. So we say, oh, there's a subtractive process going on here, there's a renewalist process going on here, a developmental process there. Excuse me. But these first two, I think the kind of raw competition vision, I can't really get behind, partially because I think there are such powerful insights in each of the different narratives. I think that you can make that argument on its own terms, in terms of scholarship, in terms of history, in terms of their argumentative strength. But also from a Baha'i perspective, one sees the resonance of these different narratives with aspects of the Baha'i writing. So again, we couldn't just say, oh, one and only one of these is true. The heuristic lens, I think, is a very valid way of looking at it. But I think the problem with that is if we only focus on kind of micro processes, we overlook the fact that in our sort of mental landscape, we're going to have big background narratives of religious history that we're using. And if we don't articulate those narratives and examine them and think about their structure and form and articulation, then I think we're going to be misrepresenting the nature of our own inquiry. So it's not by simply focusing on micro processes that we can secure the kind of rigor and groundedness of our inquiry. It's also by stepping back, articulating the biggest concepts that we have that structure our thoughts, one of which in terms of religions can be our narrative of religious history, and critique and articulate those. So in that regard, it still leaves us with the challenge of having these 7 big narratives of religion that we need to think about. So then that leads us to some kind of synthesis, some kind of reconciliation, some kind of harmonization of their various insights into kind of a common narrative. So without kind of going too much further into that, I think that the developmental narrative as kind of a base narrative, let's say, just the idea that throughout history, religion has been undergoing a stage-like process of development. It's a very simple claim, but that becomes kind of point number 1. It can include and kind of contain and sort of encompass the insights of all the other 6 narratives. So we could say as part of religion's historical development, certain aspects of earlier religious epochs are rightfully left behind, while others are problematically abandoned and ought to be renewed, revisited. But the distinctive forces of modernity are facilitating religion's transformation, not necessarily its outright marginalization and decline. The recent developments in natural science help us understand spiritual phenomena in a more profound manner. But a problematic concept of religion has taken hold of modern Western discourse and skewed our perceptions of both historical and contemporary religious dynamics, and that many religious patterns and ideas perennially appear in different contexts and settings. So if one kind of looks at that as, about as far as the academic discourse on religion has gotten, sort of taking, in a fairly loose way, but taking the kind of the core insights of these major narratives that are being put forward, we're just trying to see them all as part of a broader process of development of religion throughout history. We can see this complex process of developing emerging. I think what's fascinating is that starts to resonate in a meaningful way. I'm not going to say it's identical, but it starts to resonate in a meaningful way with the broader vision of religious history that's presented in the Baha'i Writings. And I think that's good. It's good because that creates opportunities for those who are interested in the Baha'i vision of religious history to really engage in a more deep and rigorous and systematic way with the very excellent scholarship that's being out there, to learn from it, to have their own ideas challenged and expanded and modified. At the same time, it creates opportunities for insights from the Baha'i writings to really be brought in a meaningful way into the contemporary academic discourse on religion. When I say meaningful, I mean not just in the way of, oh, the Baha'i writings say this, you should believe that. I mean, that's not scholarship. That's just kind of sort of theological proclamation or something, which in one context might be fine, but in the context of scholarship, it's useless. But what I mean here is to say that, well, we could say, all right, in the Baha'i writings, we see a certain description of the development of religion, about this idea of progressive revelation. But what are some aspects of that? What are some insights of that? What might we expect to see in religious history if this was actually describing something that was going on? You could develop a hypothesis, look at certain patterns, look at certain phenomena, and I think you just start to see possibilities for really meaningful conversation. So thanks very much for listening to the talk. Just to kind of remind you, the big 7 narratives that I presented: Subtraction Narrative, Renewal Narrative, Transsecular Narrative, Postnaturalist Narrative, Construct Narrative, Perennial Narrative, Developmental Narrative. If you read the book, I really engage with a very wide range of philosophers, of social theorists, of scholars of religion, of historians, dig into a lot of really interesting arguments and diverse perspectives. And I think you would come away with your understanding of religion, but also the richness of the contemporary academic discourse on religion, hopefully enhanced. So thank you very much, and I think we'll have some time for questions.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we do have time for questions, and this was really a fantastic, clear presentation, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to provide us this. Let me see if we've got any so far, and I have certainly got some questions if we don't have any yet. By the way, we had an entire group of people joining us at the Unity Museum up in Seattle. They're often carrying these live as well, which is quite nice. One question I guess I have is, I think what you've done is provided a good sort of solid, how shall I put it? A kind of justification of some of the Baha'i ideas about religion. Certainly you've been able to connect them very well to the existing discourses. I think there's also sort of almost a flip side to this, and that's that certainly the common understanding amongst Baha'is about the nature of the evolution of religion needs some critiquing, shall we say, or some updating. And some of those views that Baha'is hold really are anchored in some of those statements by Abdu'l-Baha about, for example, the progression of civilizations and that sort of thing, which probably don't work quite certainly as simplistically as Baha'is think. So to what extent do you think the presentation you've given also helps us to clarify our understanding of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha's view of the evolution of religion or the development of religion?
Well, I think the first thing is, I can't speak in relationship to all Baha'is' understanding of progressive revelation, but I would say that I think, again, speaking from the perspective of someone who believes in the revelation of Baha'u'llah, I think there will be no moment in history when our understanding is not deeply flawed. If you just take the assumption that there is an excess, something more in the revelation that can never be captured by human knowledge, then I think what that means is that at any given moment, there will be certain aspects of our understanding of that vision of religion or religious history that are more adequate than others, and other aspects that really need to be transformed and reevaluated. And so I think that, yes, if one wants to really think hard about how some of these processes can actually be described with scientific rigor, let's say, with empirical rigor. I think one of the points that I hope to bring out clearly is that, well, it's not just that you can look at empirical phenomena as a historian or a sociologist and somehow be sure that you're getting access to what's truly going on. The concepts that we use, the background narratives, the logic of the stories that we tell shapes very much what we see. I think, this has been known in philosophy of science for a long time. And what I was also hoping to bring out is that this is really shaping very deeply the kind of broader academic discourse on religion, historians, sociologists, anthropologists. And so that philosophical rigor to kind of step back and say, all right, let's bring out these different narratives. Let's evaluate them. Let's try to develop a robust one, or one at least that's maybe a bit more robust than maybe the one we had before. And then within that, let's start to then look more closely at what we actually see. And I think that process is one that at least I think is an important one, and that can really help Baha'is to develop a more systematic way of thinking about relating to the insights contained in the Baha'i writings. For example, one very simple perspective is that if you're going to talk about this idea of progressive revelation, you could sort of spin your wheels saying, oh, can we identify this prophet back in China or in the Native Americans or, in the sort of the Pacific Islands or in ancient Egypt? And in one sense, that's fine. But it's a very limited way of going forward. For most of human history, you're just not going to have access to those kind of historical records, and you'll sort of end up with a lot of speculation. But so then, you might say, well, then if we're thinking about like a kind of progressive revelation, and once we've drawn insight from kind of, let's say, this developmental narrative that you find in scholarship, you might say, well, what we could do is in the Baha'i writings, it also describes this kind of the coming of a different messenger as a moment in which there's this kind of ramified transformation of civilization, of thought, of culture, of religion. So you could then just begin to look at those moments of major transformation. What was happening? How did it work? What was the relationship between intellectual, religious, spiritual, moral, economic processes and phenomena? Were there any kind of correlations more broadly throughout the world? Were there resonances? Were there divergences? And then you just start to look, at the same phenomena, but from a different angle. And I think by having thought about the Baha'i vision of religion in relationship to these other developmental narratives of religion, for lack of a better term, that you can start to think in that way a bit more clearly. But let's say you wanted to think, well, what are Baha'is doing in their community building processes? Well, you read Alasdair MacIntyre and his idea of establishing new forms of of social relationships in which new virtues can manifest themselves. And slowly they provide the bedrock or the soil out of which a new civilization can emerge that's not just fixing modernity from within or Western modernity from within, but it's sort of starting on the fringes and building the basis for something totally new. So again, you get more insight into what is happening, or at least one way to think about it. And I think that's at least what I was hoping to kind of make a bit more easy, at least for those who are going to be coming at this book from a Baha'i perspective.
Well, we do have some questions now, I'm glad to say. Shahla says, is there a chronology to these 7 ways of looking at religion, or are they all contemporary? I think by chronology she means that some of them have been replaced by others. Sorry, I don't know any of the people you quoted, she added, which of course these are fairly well-known people within the field of philosophy of religion or history of religious studies, but wouldn't necessarily be well-known to the general Baha'is.
Sure. What can I say? You either know them or you don't. Maybe now you do know them.
Now you've heard of them.
Now you've heard of them.
I wasn't sure how to pronounce Plantinga myself.
So I think on the point of the chronology, one could probably try to articulate a chronology with some degree of accuracy within the modern Western discourse. And you would go back, I think, there's a book called A New Science, The Discovery of Religion During the Age of Enlightenment, I think is the subtitle, by Guy Strunza. He's a French-Israeli historian of religion. And he does a bit of that, in which he shows how these kind of early modern priests and sort of gentlemen scholars and, colonialists were developing some of these ideas about, for example, the development of religion. You start to see, well, okay, there's religion in China, and then there's religion in Africa, and then there's religion in India, and some of these are really sophisticated, and so how do we make sense of Christianity? Or then others would start to say, no, it's actually there was this true religion that we've now lost, and it's this kind of Oriental mythic kind of East that we need to kind of renew, and so renewal narrative. Right? So again, you see the origins of these narratives, but I mean, I don't think that so in the Western discourse, you can trace the origins, but then you start to dig back into Islamic religious history and scholarship, and it gets really complex, partially because there are vast libraries of materials that haven't really been translated yet or engaged by Western scholars in a systematic way. So where some of these arguments are beginning or not beginning, or if there are resonances in China or in India, I can't really say. But at least in the Western discourse, you can start to see some of them. But then they also all are contemporary insofar as people are making these arguments today. I think that the subtraction narrative, particularly in its kind of classical vision of secularization, that is something that begins really in the, it begins in the kind of mid to late 18th century, but it starts to become prominent in the 19th century, and then it starts to become kind of common sense in the 20th century.
Sure.
So,
my impression is that all seven of these have a lengthy history. I remember when I was in my doctoral program looking at the whole question of the evolution of religion, and the idea that religion has evolved itself has changed quite a lot. Has evolved. The idea of the religion evolving has evolved, and Bella's 1955 article about the evolution of religion, which is now that massive book you mentioned, but it started out as that 30-page article. That fascinated me. At that time, unfortunately, at my education, we did not talk about Jespers or any of these other guys, unfortunately, so I didn't have access to that information. But Bella was really, I think, much more sophisticated than the previous arguments about evolution of religion. And that's why the idea of religion evolving really had kind of gotten completely out of fashion for a while. In some ways, you're trying to revive it.
Yeah, I think, obviously it's something that I would argue for. I do argue for, but I also think that it doesn't need my help in being revived. Others are very much reviving it from various perspectives as well.
So here's some more questions. Jeanette says, how can we understand and address atheism given these seven perspectives on religion?
Well, I think one interesting point to kind of clarify is that you can be an atheist and tell different stories of religious history, right? So that atheism isn't just sort of Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is an atheist. Not all atheists are Richard Dawkins. Yeah. Richard Dawkins tells a subtraction narrative. That's the logic he uses. Daniel Dennett tells a subtraction narrative. All these kind of new atheists, they tell a subtraction narrative. But then there are other atheists which would say, yeah, religion is transforming. It's kind of a transsecular process. There might be atheists who say, actually the way religious civilizations worked was in many ways better than the way modern civilizations worked. So we need to somehow renew patterns of those. So they can be an atheist. It could be an atheist who says, Thomas Nagel, for example, as an atheist philosopher, he presents a version of this postnaturalist narrative. He says, actually, the kind of teleological visions of nature, which religiously minded thinkers were articulating, they might really have something to teach us about the way nature actually works that can help us explain the existence of something like the human mind. Construct narratives, again, a lot of them will be atheists. A lot of them won't be as well. So I think in each of these narratives, you can have an atheist formulation of them, and you can have a formulation in which that's connected with some vision of transcendence and divinity. And I think in one way, I think that allows us to see the richness and the possibilities of both religious and non-religious thought. And so it can maybe help us avoid easy generalizations about kind of atheism and religion and maybe kind of, take the conversation a bit more deep. And I think that the level of narrative is more interesting than the level of belief and unbelief. Because belief and unbelief, well, you can believe or not believe in a lot of different ways. And I think those ways are more interesting than the kind of big dichotomy that we tend to find.
Jeanette also asks, how do these 7 ways of looking at religion help us understand and address Islamic terrorism?
Yeah, I mean,
in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you understand the idea of a renewal narrative, suddenly fundamentalism, conservatism, nostalgia, all these things, they start to make sense. There's a common story that's behind it all. And that story is that at some earlier period of history, we were in touch with a truer, a more authentic religious truth or orientation. We fell away from that during modernity, and that's where all the problems of the modern world have come from. If we want to then solve those problems, we have to then renew our engagement with that older religious truth. Now we can do that creatively, constructively, through certain kinds of if you think of Gandhi in a way, that was a renewal narrative. It was about India has lost touch with its true spiritual roots and needs to kind of revitalize those in the face of capitalism and outside oppression. So that was a renewal narrative, but it was constructive in many ways. And then I think certain forms of jihadist ideology we see are renewal narratives, but in a very destructive way. But then I think just to sort of see the commonalities, that it's the narrative of renewal that somehow is what's uniting all of these different phenomena of Hindu nationalism, of Buddhist nationalism, of Jewish nationalism, of jihadism, of evangelical conservatism, of sort of nostalgia for the kind of the tribal or the indigenous or early spirituality. And I think once you just see the common links between those, somehow it makes what otherwise would look to be a very dizzying and kind of diverse range of phenomena actually very clear. It's part of a common thing just being taken in different directions.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and that reminds me very much of the study of fundamentalisms, the global study of fundamentalisms that was so big in the 1990s, with a whole series of volumes coming out looking at fundamentalism from a cross-cultural perspective. And in each case, they were talking about it being a kind of renewal narrative of trying to return to roots.
Yeah.
Other questions here, and I don't see any right now, but I'm sure we'll have some more coming. I thought perhaps we should turn a little bit to this whole axial age issue and the new book that you're working on, since it clearly connects your closing slide. We were talking about a synthesis of these 7. In many ways, seems to me as a segue to talking about a narrative about a new axial age. And I was wondering if you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, so my next book project is called Encountering the Axial Age. I hope to have it done in about a year. And what the axial age thesis is, it was an idea put forth by a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, just after the conclusion of the Second World War. In a book, it's been translated into English, the title is The Origin and Goal of History. And what Jaspers was doing was, after the Second World War, he realized that maybe the whole problem with Western civilization didn't have to do with, it lost touch with its liberal roots, or it became overwhelmed by kind of capitalism, which were the major arguments that you found at that time, which was sort of what went wrong with the Second World War, the first 2 world wars. Well, there's the American answer, which is modern Western civilization stopped being liberal in the way that it should have been, or the Soviet answer, which was modern Western civilization became too capitalistic and lost touch with this kind of collectivist trajectory. And Jaspers realized that both those arguments were still fundamentally Western-centric, but they preserved the kind of triumphalism that led to the sort of imperialist insanity that preceded the first 2 and sort of caused the first 2 world wars. So we thought, in order to have a kind of a global future, we needed to have a story of history that wasn't Western-centric, wasn't Eurocentric, and wasn't Christocentric. And so we had to get out of this kind of this narrative that was just repeating itself in sort of this kind of vision of world liberalism and this vision of world socialism. And so he said, in order to do that, we had to have a different vision of kind of the key turning point in human history. Because he says the Western-centric vision of history comes from the idea that somehow that Jesus Christ was the culmination of all religious history. And so when he kind of culminated religious history, then the civilization that he influenced became the kind of the truest or highest or leading civilization. So this is Western civilization. So then this gives rise to a certain narrative about Western civilization and its kind of manifest destiny to rule and remake the whole world. And again, imperialism, colonialism, kind of global liberalism, global socialism, they're all versions of that story. So then Jasper said, well, if we want to get a non-kind of Eurocentric, non-Western-centric vision of history, we need like a non-Christocentric vision of religious history, a broader vision of this kind of common axis that unites humanity as opposed to kind of centering the story of history around one people. So he said, what we can see that kind of common axis in this period during the first millennium BCE across Eurasia, when within a couple hundred years, the kind of major religious and philosophical lineages that still influence most of the people in the world today emerged around the same time in resonant ways. The Greek philosophy, Hebrew prophecy, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Jainism, Upanishadic Hinduism, the 100 schools of thought in China, which generated Confucianism, Taoism, and all of this was happening around the same time. So he says this was like this collective period of fundamental spiritual transformation that set expanding segments of humanity upon similar kind of developmental trajectories. And so he then says, once we have this vision of this kind of first millennium BCE axial age, what that helps us to realize is that maybe this period of kind of globalization is not just the dominance of the West, but it's kind of a new transformation that will take place amongst the whole of the human race. And it's not going to be just kind of the winning out of one older tradition. It's not going to be the triumph of some Western thing, but it's going to be some return to that kind of common spiritual essence that created the axial age. But now it's going to remake kind of global civilization all at once. Because we don't know what it's going to look like. We can't know what it's going to look like. But by simply accepting that possibility, our minds are opened in a way that we can start to see kind of pathways towards something new and trajectories. So this idea, in a very remarkable way, has been taken up and developed by some of the kind of heavyweights of a number of different disciplines. I mean, I can mention names. I don't know if all you will know them. I'll mention them. Now you know them. But someone like Eric Vogelin, Louis Mumford, Schewel Eisenstadt, Benjamin Schwartz, Jürgen Habermas, Hans Joas, Robert Bella, Charles Taylor, John Hick, Marshall Hodgson, Samuel Huntington. I mean, these huge titans of their various fields all made the idea of the axial age central to their project. But there hadn't really been an attempt to kind of bring all those different voices together and to show them as kind of contributors to a common discourse on the axial age, and then to really say, well, what are they trying to do with this concept of the axial age? And what I argue is that they're trying to tell a new story of religious history. And that really makes sense of this kind of, we should think of it in terms of this post-secular problematic. It's a developmental vision of religious history, and that there are certain kind of stages of religious history they tend to commonly describe. So what are the debates that emerge around those stages? How are the kind of the transition from one stage to the next envisioned? And then really, what does that mean about kind of the world today and the future and the kind of transition through which humanity is proceeding today? So that's what I'm doing in the book, really trying to just chart the contours of that discourse in a similar way I did in this book, but then also to bring out the insights and limitations of that and to say, okay, well then what kind of story of religious history, if we take the collective insights of this whole rich body of discourse and try to bring it together in a coherent way, what kind of story would we start to tell? Yeah, I think there again, one could probably do something similar, but even at a more sophisticated level with the Baha'i Writings, and to say, all right, now let's really start to look more closely at the relationships, ways that you could draw insight from the axial age discourse, ways in which maybe facets of it, if you brought insights from the Baha'i Writings, could really be illumined and transformed and elevated. I'll probably write an article or two that does that. So that's in a way kind of the intellectual project. And I think it's important then to just say that, scholarship is its own world of discourse, and that the purpose of that discourse from a Baha'i perspective is not to somehow make it mirror what the Baha'i writings say. I mean, it's its own field, has its own arguments, its own structure, and we can trust that in the long term, if what the Baha'i writings describe is true, if that's just pursued, that scholarship in a rigorous and kind of rationally robust way, it'll evolve in ways that make it resonate more and more with the vision presented in the Baha'i writings. But the Baha'i writings ultimately are not trying to be scholarship. They're not, Baha'u'llah was not a philosopher, he was not a historian. He's presenting words that are meant to transform humanity and civilization. And so I think just not trying to kind of draw strict equivalence between scholarship and the Baha'i writings, but allowing a kind of conversation and exchange, discourse, mutual insights to be drawn and shared. For me, at least, I find the most productive way of advancing.
Yeah, thank you. I was just received an email saying there's some questions on our YouTube channel, but I don't know how to get there. So Boyd, if you could hunt those up and drop them here into the questions and answers on the screen for me, that would be very helpful. Paul Mantle asks an interesting question about Hegel. Do you care to comment on Shoghi Effendi's analysis of Hegelian philosophy? And he also asks about Jack McLean's gloss on Hegelianism in A Celestial Burning.
I haven't read Celestial Burning, so I can't comment on it. And I think, as I recall from Shoghi Effendi's analysis, which I think is fairly truncated, fairly short, a few comments about kind of Marxism and Hegel, and more about the rise of the kind of the left and this new materialism and this new kind of messianism of socialism. And I think the argument presented there is one that a lot of readers of Hegel would support, which is to say that his vision of history, which culminates religiously in Christianity, socially and politically in Western European civilization, and perhaps more specifically 19th century Prussian society as being the kind of culmination of history, it leads to a kind of very aggressive and potentially destructive sort of idea about, one civilization or one people or one social form being the end of history. And then if you are the end of history, well, anything that doesn't look like you either needs to be dominated by you, destroyed by you, reformed to look like you. And, I think some of the false gods that Shoghi Effendi describes that has been worshipped during modernity are very much kind of connecting with that, whether it's about race, whether it's about kind of socialism, whether it's about nation, and these kind of the logic is very Hegelian, which is somehow we have reached the culmination of history. Now everyone needs to look like us, be dominated by us, or be destroyed by us. And I think that that's one way in which Hegelian thought can go and has historically gone. Whether that's the true meaning of Hegel's arguments, a million people will debate, but at least as it's been embodied in history, that's one of the ways in which it's been prominently used.
Yeah, that's very helpful, actually. And I think that helps answer or bring up another issue I wanted to raise or ask about, and that's that when one looks at the various religions throughout history, one can classify some as, to use Bella's terms, primal, archaic, axial, which is not the term he used, modern, and of course he even talks about postmodern, which in the context in the 50s was secular. He had a secularization hypothesis in his original theory. And it's all right when you look at Egyptian religion and you say, okay, it's sort of archaic. But I think it's a sort of a different situation when you look at, say, Lakota religion and you're dealing with Lakota people. I think one then has a different kind of, I don't know whether I wanted to say a different sort of language one uses or a different conception of how one talks about these traditions when they're living traditions. I'd say it's a little more sensitive or a little more complicated.
Sure. Yeah, I think, people will inevitably, people don't like being kind of placed in a stage of religious history. And there will obviously be some sensitivity to that. And I think, that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of debate about and even pushback against the historical tendency to say, oh, we can identify evolutionary development in religion, so now what? Because, I come from this religious tradition, like I'm part of the past, I'm a fossil, and you're part of the future. Fine. I mean, these arguments can emerge, and they do emerge. But I also think at the same time, like, we look at human history, we see certain patterns, new stages of complexity and capacity emerge. And I think as long as you recognize that complexity or emergent structures is not necessarily associated with moral and spiritual superiority,
right,
that helps you get over it, which is to say someone can be more moral and live in a non-literate tradition. We would still say that a literate civilization is more complex than a non-literate civilization, but it doesn't mean it's morally or spiritually better.
Right.
And I think that is an important distinction to make that can help kind of soften some of the kind of potential, tensions that might emerge when these arguments are put forth.
Right, and your comments about the negative tendencies of some of the Hegelian arguments, I think, also highlighted exactly the issue that we need to avoid those negative tendencies and be quite self-conscious of the possibility that they'll develop. So that's one of the reasons why I raised that issue. I don't see any other questions here. The question on YouTube apparently was not worth bringing to the attention of everybody. So I think we're finished with this questions and answers, and I want to thank you again for this fascinating presentation, and thank you also for a little bit of information about your next book, which we'll be looking forward to. And Yale Press will be the beneficiary of some very important and new insights into the nature of religion, and I do hope that the field of religion takes all of this very seriously. It's very difficult, I think, up until now. Very rarely have Baha'is been able to make an impact on the field of religion in a specifically Baha'i-inspired way, and I think as our understanding of both the writings of the faith, the teachings of the faith, and our understanding of these different fields continue to grow, our ability to connect the two and to illuminate the academic fields will continue to improve. So I thank you very much for being one of the great light bearers out there in moving that connection between the faith and academia forward. I think it's very important. We have already one person I see saying thanks a lot also.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really terrific. It's always a pleasure to get to share one's research with an interested audience. If you get the chance to take a look at the book, I think you would find it useful. One last bit of advice I can recommend is allow yourself to focus on the forest and not get lost in the trees. A lot of names and terms are mentioned, but I think that I wrote the book. My father and mother, who neither of whom were academics, were sort of line editors of the book. And what I said is that they should be able to understand the arguments that I'm making. They understood them. They appreciated them. So I think if you're the kind of person who signs up for this course, you can also understand them and appreciate them. Just allow names like Heidegger and Hegel to sort of wash over you, and I think you'll get the point.
Very good.